Just a quick disclaimer, before I talk about any of the games, movies, or shows in this video, I wanted to let y'all know that I'll be going into heavy detail about certain story elements, plot progression, and potential gameplay regarding the series in question. As such, there will be numerous spoilers for franchises that are both complete and ongoing, so this will be your one and only warning. There's also going to be a few scenes with flashing lights and quickly changing colors, so please take that into account if you have epilepsy or other seizure-inducing conditions. You have been warned. This video contains heavy spoilers for Demon Slayer, Kingdom Hearts, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and some films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Growing up, I watched a lot of cartoons. Like, an unhealthy amount of cartoons. I didn't really appreciate live-action movies until way later in life, but I did learn to immerse myself in digital media way faster by learning about animation and how it's made. Of course, that kind of analytical sense didn't develop until I was a teenager, but as a child I still found myself watching animated television more than I did other kinds. Pokemon, Fairly Odd Parents, Kids Next Door, Kim Possible, American Dragon Jake Long, SpongeBob, Danny Phantom, Digimon, Courage the Cowardly Dog, the list goes on and on and on. And as a child, the more of this stuff you consume, the better for network showrunners. Your favorite shows were played all the time. Even between new weekly episodes, television shows would keep you hooked by replaying the same season's episodes on reruns every day. It was fairly easy to keep up with television in the 90s and 2000s. You could catch the newest episode of your favorite show, then click over to another channel that strategically aired their new episodes a little later to get you hooked on theirs as well. This kind of marketing isn't really looked at much anymore with the push to get more content on streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and Disney Plus, where they release entire seasons at a time for you to binge, but it was popular for a long time. You wouldn't know it if you didn't watch TV all the time, but this kind of oversaturation made it really easy to shower the viewership with your show, and it made it really difficult to understand when they actually ended properly. When I was 8 years old, I had a magnificent pipe dream of someday owning a library. When I wasn't at home in front of a TV or PlayStation, I was sitting at the back of a classroom reading children's chapter books. Social interaction wasn't really my thing, and it was easy to get lost in the worlds of Magic Treehouse, Redwall, and Alex Rider. Reading a book with any kind of imagination was a great way for me to pass the time, but also to stir my own creativity. Maybe even more so than video games and animation, books were central for me growing up because they encouraged me to actually pick up a pen and write stories. I still have my little notebooks from elementary school where I doodled and wrote short stories about fantasy and my own adaptations or sequels to books and movies that I was keeping up with. And because of that and my high marks in language arts classes going through school, I'm here today writing scripts for YouTube videos. But the pattern you begin to notice when reading as a kid is that each story that's targeted for your demographic never really comes to a close. The characters always have some item or idea that can carry over into the next book that was only 50 to 75 pages long and came out every other month. You were never without your beloved franchise for very long every single year. Video games are the art medium that introduced me to the idea of stories having a start and an end point. Each game that you went out to buy was incredibly expensive, so depending on how ambitious ambitious a game developer was feeling, they'd need to create an entire world with interesting characters that told a complete story from start to end. Gaming in the early days really cemented this in, as it was never guaranteed that your fledgling studio on experimental hardware was going to be guaranteed more than one game. Video games like Spyro the Dragon, Metal Gear Solid, Banjo-Kazooie, and Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time are all well known as entries in massive multi-console generation franchises, but they weren't always that way. Spyro 1 ends with the Purple Dragon himself taking a load off after torching Nasty Nork and freeing all his friends and family. Metal Gear Solid ends with Solid Snake taking off into the sunset with a new companion, with the promise of choosing a new path in life, divorced from violence and betrayal. Banjo-Kazooie ends after booting Grunty off of a cliff and entombed with a boulder, burying the only threat to the entire world. Ocarina of Time ends with Link finishing off Ganondorf and restoring the timeline, getting sent back to his own time to live out the life that he was supposed to have instead of that of a hero. Each of these have complete endings, and you could believe that their narratives were all wrapped up by the end of each game. But at the end of the 5th console generation, something strange started to happen. Video games started crossing over with other entertainment industries. Video games became mainstream, and content from both mediums started influencing one another. TV shows started fashioning themselves after video game worlds and brought more entries in their franchises to homes everywhere. Video games started getting tie-in licensed titles to expand their universes and allow people to take control of their favorite show's characters. Perhaps most of all, with bigger budgets and established franchises, the way video game stories were told started mimicking that of television, movies, and books. Spyro would go on to get 2 more PS1 titles, 2 more 6th generation console titles, and a reboot trilogy on the 7th. Metal Gear Solid would go on to become one of the largest video game franchises of all time, with over 5 sequels and multiple spin-offs. Banjo-Kazooie got 2 mainline sequels and a few handheld releases, and The Legend of Zelda would go on to be the 3rd most popular Nintendo franchise, with sequels and spin-offs across just about every console under the banner. Suddenly, these once confined experiences that established a complete, satisfying story were now open to interpretation with additional narrative that took place after and sometimes before each other. Video games began getting treated like traditional media. How marketable can we make this entry into our franchise? How big are we going to be able to make its world? How long of a story can we write? And how many games can we get out of that story? Will the characters be likable? And do we have enough room for growth in the characters that hit it off with the audience? Video games began to feel less like a story and more like an ad campaign. Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba is a Japanese manga series, written and also illustrated by one Koyoharu Gotoge, and ran in Weekly Shonen Jump magazine from February 2016 to May 2020. With a grand total of 23 volumes published by Viz Media, Demon Slayer follows the life of the protagonist Tanjiro Kamado, a young man living in Taisho-era Japan who is forced into the life of a swordsman after a demon slaughters his family and morphs his younger sister Nezuko into one as well. Tanjiro's goal is to work his way up the chain of command and slay the leader of the demons, Muzan Kibutsuji, and find a cure for his sister and revert her to being a human. Tanjiro's journey takes him all over Japan, from the steep cliff terrain of the misty mountaintops to the bustling and raunchy streets of the Red Light District. He encounters many foes of varying levels of strength throughout, as well as the mighty power of the demon slayers are capable of. He strives to attain this strength and is constantly forced to grow stronger before finally confronting Muzan himself alongside the other demon slayers. In the end, several of the other main characters die, and Tanjiro has to confront his own inner demons, pun intended, head on before things come to a close. The story ends when Nezuko is successfully cured of her affliction and saves Tanjiro before the remaining few nephew retire to the countryside to be together. In a post-story epilogue, it's revealed that their modern-age descendants live together in Japan alongside reincarnations of previous slayers from long ago. One of the immediately interesting things about Demon Slayer is that the series establishes a few goals for the protagonists immediately. Nezuko needs to be cured, and Muzan needs to be slain. It's implied that by the end of the story, one or both of these will be accomplished. Having a realistic and straightforward goal sets the expectation for the story, allowing for reasonable character growth and changes in the setting to signal narrative progression. Tanjiro literally starts from the bottom as a poor charcoal salesman with an indomitable, kind-hearted nature and almost supernatural sense of smell. Through trials and tribulations, intense training, and relentless setbacks, he eventually becomes one of the strongest swordsmen of the Demon Slayer Corps, rivaling that of the Slayers ranked number 1 and 2. Because of his caring personality, Tanjiro is able to forge bonds with friend and foe alike, changing the outcome of certain encounters purely by being a good person. This lets conflicts resolve properly and completely throughout the entire story, and every character that's introduced has an arc that is ended in a satisfying way before the ultimate conclusion. These character arcs range from a wide variety, everything from simple betrayal and trust plots to earning to overcome an inner flaw that person had. Even something as convoluted as a deeply embedded inferiority complex is almost completely reversed by the end of the story, turning a complete coward of a character into a proper swordsman just like the rest of the Demon Slayer Corps. Zenitsu's character growth is one of my favorite things about this franchise, and it's done in service of providing a finished ending to the entire plot. Kingdom Hearts is an action RPG video game series created by Japanese developer Square Enix, headed by Tetsuya Nomura and Shinji Hashimoto. The franchise combines two of the most popular IPs from Japan and America, that being Final Fantasy and Walt Disney Animation, respectively. The series combines the two into an epic spanning 13 video games, a manga adaptation for each mainline title, and a cancelled anime production based on the first game. Truly a shame, that one. The franchise centers around the adventures of a boy named Sora, who's chosen by a special weapon in the game's universe called the Keyblade. He's grouped up with Donald Duck and Goofy of Disney fame to fight the forces of evil threatening the sanctity of the worlds, themed after Disney and Final Fantasy properties. Sora will forge relationships with princesses, soldiers, bachelors, and fellow Keyblade wielders, uncovering plots of wickedness by dastardly villains, and one really grouchy old man with a god complex. Growing up, Sora and his friends dreamed of seeing the outside world and what it had to offer. Despite living on the sunny shores of Destiny Islands, a true paradise for many, including myself, he yearned for adventure and grandeur, going so far as to make wooden swords and make up games with his friends and rivals that also lived on the islands. Before long, Sora is whisked away through the darkness and thrust into the middle of a plot to take over the many worlds that sat far beyond his own. This franchise is notorious for its overwhelming plot and self-referential lore. It's a difficult franchise to bust into nowadays because the narrative is so dense, with games across multiple console and handheld generations containing vital information to the story in just about all of them. Recent attempts have made it much easier to experience the franchise, like HD re-releases and compilations of previous titles, but even in doing so, Kingdom Hearts ends up with a muddy and confusing storyline to even the most hardened of veteran players. This franchise used to be episodic in nature, meaning that each story was contained to their own game. Kingdom Hearts 1 tells the simple story of trusting your friends, recognizing and breaking your personal limits, and to never never give up, even in the face of incredible odds. Sora starts his adventure as an incredibly naive boy, though with a keen sense of justice and the wanting to spread happiness. He learns to fight for the sake of others and spread his goodwill wherever he goes. The first game ends with him punishing the forces of darkness that sought to envelop the world, but at the cost of being separated from his friends once again. Sora grows from a child with visions of grandeur to a force for good, helping everyone he comes across if he can. But with each entry in the franchise, the series becomes more bloated, introducing concepts exclusive to each other in each game, but later being forced together as if it was meant to be all this time. Separate ideals overlapped with each other, and the theme of each game became muddled by a new overarching theme introduced by a nemesis that didn't actually exist until halfway down the line. Sora's development as a character stalled, and these important themes and arcs became buried as the series prolonged a conclusion to Sora and his friends' growth. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a fantasy action animated series created by Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, produced and published by Nickelodeon. Among the diverse cultures of this franchise world are people capable of manipulating one of the elements that make up the environment: water, earth, fire, and air. This ability is called bending, and is a major factor in how the different civilizations of the world, which each align with one of the elements, interact with one another. The only person capable of bending all four elements, a human with a direct connection to the spiritual realm known as the Avatar, is also given the immense responsibility to maintain harmony among the four nations. Whenever the balance of power tips too far in any direction, or a threat appears from the spirit realm, it's up to the Avatar to set things right and restore peace. This series follows the adventure of a 12-year-old boy known as Aang, the last of the air nomads and most recent Avatar, along with his fast friends from the water tribe Katara and Sokka, and a blind earthbending prodigy named Toph, as they work to find a way to stop the Fire Nation's conquest of the other cultures. Along the way, Aang must master each of the four bending styles, as well as contend with the disgraced Fire Nation Prince Zuko, who pursues Aang in an attempt to restore his lost honor and rejoin his family at the throne. If Aang cannot stop the Fire King's assault, the world will remain subjugated by a power-hungry dictator for generations to come. The Last Airbender is probably one of the best examples of letting a story finish to completion in modern entertainment. Aang begins his journey as a reluctant hero. He never wanted the responsibility of being the Avatar, and fled his home before his training could properly begin. After being frozen in ice and awakening 100 years later, Aang is forced to take action after learning of the Fire Nation's assault on the rest of the world. Slowly, over the course of the entire series, Aang learns the value of fighting for others, and begins taking his duties more seriously. He becomes a respected warrior and force for justice, all while maintaining his moral values. Despite the entire show taking the place over the course of a single summer, while the franchise itself lasted a few years, Aang is allowed to grow and reach a conclusive end for a well-earned character arc. And not only this, but the people around him mature as well. Sokka begins his journey as a stubborn jokester with a superiority complex, but after being forced into real combat with benders and soldiers from all nations, he matures into a competent leader capable of planning and securing victory. Katara was forced to grow up and care for her brother and the young ones in her village, but learned to care for herself and foster her own innate abilities to protect people instead of help fix them. Toph grows to recognize her true potential, while also letting her guard down to people who genuinely care for her without trying to be her shield. Zuko gets perhaps the biggest character growth of the entire series, going from being a vengeful and confused hunter of the Avatar to being a trusted and dependable ally after forging his own honor. In April of 2008, the world was introduced to the first entry in a soon-to-be long line of action-packed superhero films that would completely change the film and entertainment industries for decades to come. Marvel Studios' Iron Man graced the silver screen to audience and critical acclaim, being chosen as one of the 10 best films of the year by the American Film Institute, and even receiving nominations for Best Sound Editing and Best Visual Effects in that year's Academy Awards. Directed by Jon Favreau and starring Robert Downey Jr. as the main character, Iron Man follows the story of the son of a weapons contractor and billionaire playboy Anthony Stark, and his quest for redemption following his capture and witness to the harmful destruction his inherited company has delivered upon the world. Stark uses his genius intellect and vast resources to fabricate a suit of armor capable of flight, mobile communication and networking, and deploying weapons, taking the fight directly to the warmongers using his company's name to destroy people's lives. When he discovers that a representative and family friend working within his own company have purposely been supplying arms dealers with his technology and weapons, Stark confronts him directly with his newfound morality in a battle of attrition. He eventually gets the upper hand and defeats the traitor, and in a statement to the world, Stark admits his identity as the masked superhero known as Iron Man. The Marvel Cinematic Universe would greatly expand from this point on, spurring 10 seasons of daytime television shows, 13 seasons of Netflix exclusive crossover series, 6 seasons of explicitly young adult network franchises, 12 seasons of Disney Plus tie-in shows, and a whopping total of 32 additional films to date. Generally, this franchise receives positive critical and fan acclaim, as the material is inclusive and appeals to a wide audience, though that acclaim has tapered off as of late, and while there are many reasons why this could be, for me, it's the obvious lack of cohesion between each entry. Marvel Studios release their films in chunks, tied together with a narrative through line that establishes a goal and direction for each movie to follow. For Phase 1, the goal was to bring together the Avengers through the covert S.H.I.E.L.D. agency. In Phase 2, after S.H.I.E.L.D.'s disbandment, the Avengers need to prove to themselves that they're capable of working together without a guiding hand. In Phase 3, the Avengers are broken up and pulled back together again when a cosmic threat descends upon Earth. Phase 4 began a new saga in the MCU, and things haven't really been the same. Phases 1 through 3 dictated an endpoint, like things were ultimately culminating in the confrontation of that film. After this epic battle that paid off 10 years of filmmaking, character development, and narrative development, the road ahead seemed less clear. Mainstay characters had died or were written off the franchise, the biggest threat to the universe had perished, and a new one has yet to take their place. The idea of the multiverse has been poked and prodded since the conclusion of Phase 3, but any meaningful connection to it and the bigger picture has yet to be established, leaving many projects in the MCU recently feeling stuck and mediocre. Stories should be entertaining to observe. They should be fun to read, to watch, or to play. You want your characters to encounter obstacles and overcome them. The setting should be enriching, providing lore and scenic storytelling. Even if the plot is kind of predictable, you want it to follow its own rules and bring the characters and people through it effortlessly. When you finish a good story, it should leave you feeling satisfied, or at the very least, you can understand how they got there. A story isn't good because it lasts forever. Everything that has a beginning should have an effective ending as well, narratively closing the gap on how its characters started and how they ended, their growth and their changes on full display. In complete stories, like Demon Slayer and The Last Airbender, characters are given time to show us amazing adventures and wondrous people, but also conclude their tales with proper development and realizing their goals. Tanjiro begins as a novice swordsman, learning basic techniques and dicing through simple foes, but ends his story as an accomplished veteran after learning the most difficult techniques and defeating the strongest foe, befriending many and enriching the lives that he comes into contact with. Aang's journey starts with him as a carefree youth, actively spurning and running away from his responsibilities as the Avatar. After meeting Katara and Sokka, and touring the world after being ravaged by the Fire Nation for 100 years, he grows to accept his duties and matures into a scion of heroism. If a story becomes too big for its own good, it's very easy for characters to get lost in their narrative and personality growth. Franchises like Kingdom Hearts and the MCU unfortunately have started to recently fall into this category. Sora's role as a Keyblade Master isn't earned easily or quickly. It takes 2 separate journeys for him to fully conquer his insecurities and establish connections, and yet by the time the 3rd game finally rolls around, which is supposed to be the final entry in a franchise-spanning saga, Sora's personal comeuppance in maturity seems to have been shelved, as he's written to have forgotten all the lessons and personality he developed in previous entries of this franchise. As well as messy character development, the story being told suffers from the oversaturation of fantasy elements introduced throughout each game. Things like time travel, alternate dimensions, multiple personalities dwelling within the same person, amazing abilities and gameplay being forgotten during cinematic sequences. All of this ruins what had previously been contained in each game to date. The MCU lately has been feeling this same kind of pressure. Movies in each phase would individually teach the heroes lessons on becoming better heroes, or at the very least, change their morality or sense of duty. The first 2 Iron Man movies teach Tony Stark valuable lessons about accountability and selflessness. Captain America: The Winter Soldier promotes the idea of individuality and the benefit of the doubt. Guardians of the Galaxy is steeped with found family themes and learning to be vulnerable to each other. These lessons were carried over in the team-up movies at the end of each phase, and the heroes are shown with tangible growth every time. Overall, I feel like the entertainment industry as a whole has kind of gone astray. Video games used to be these little self-contained stories that could be told and played, with everything you needed to understand written onto one disc. But the most popular games nowadays are the ones with massive multiplayer followings, focusing on intense gameplay and repetitive functionality. The kind where you're dropped into a massive arena, duking it out with other players, or games with violence for the sake of it as the only draw. Single-player narrative experiences still exist and absolutely win awards at the end of the year, but the corporate industry decides to ignore that in favor of live service money grubbing. Movies and television seem to be headed in the same direction. The biggest franchises in the market, like the MCU superheroes and regular episodic series like Fast and Furious, Transformers, and Mission Impossible, continue to throw millions at their productions that no longer carry any meaningful impact to their characters. Dominic Toretto's character stopped developing when he accepted a member of the justice system into his family in the 4th movie. The human protagonist of the Transformers franchise has changed 3 times, though the Autobot roster is constantly changing, and Optimus Prime has a personality swap every 3 movies. The most recent MCU projects all feel disconnected, with the very loose and very subjective plot device of the multiverse pushing the franchise's plot now. Character arcs from the franchise's origin have finished, and the ones that remain haven't been able to work together towards a common threat yet. Team-up movies happen within the smaller installments, and they usually involve fighting each other instead of working with one another. This is all to say that, personally, I want to start seeing more stories with a specific endgame in mind. You need to have a goal for your characters to accomplish to make them grow in the first place, and seeing them go without that growth, or have them go back on it for the sake of an interesting story, is redundant and tiresome. The satisfaction of seeing your weak protagonist reach the height of their abilities is something truly remarkable. Learning their lessons, growing as a person, achieving great accomplishments are all things that are part of a hero's story. They're supposed to fail from time to time. They're supposed to discover themselves and reach a conclusion. A franchise isn't good because it lasts forever or even longer than it should. If something gets to be too big for its own good, then the story itself becomes unsatisfying as a result. All of that growth means nothing. All of the trials and tribulations become worthless if the main character is forced to learn them over and over again. Your protagonist should be able to use their journey as a meter for success, not as a line of redundancy to look back on and say, "Look how far we've come, eh?" Let your protagonist slay the ultimate life form. Let your main character disable the fire-breathing dictator. Your story will be a much better one when it has a complete, well thought out ending, I promise. That all just about does it for me, folks. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to stay awesome, be kind and rewind, and have a wonderful night. Excelsior.